Thank you, everybody, for coming here tonight. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, but hopefully you had some drinks, and I spent some time trying to negotiate if we could get into the Aston Martin, but that didn't go so well. So although if some of you didn't see, you see the headlights opened up and the guns came out, it's actually a pretty neat trick. It's probably a little bit too on the nose that we're actually doing this at the Spy Museum. I swear it's a beautiful location with a lot to learn in D.C., but nothing more than that. I want to tell you a little bit about the Alexander Hamilton Society, for those who don't know us. Our mission, we're a 501c3 non-for-profit, nonpartisan organization, and our mission is to identify, educate, and launch young men and young women into the foreign policy and national security world imbued with what we call Hamiltonian values. And I could wax philosophically, academically, politically about what that means, but fundamentally it means a deep belief in American exceptionalism, a deep belief that we have a special role to play in the world, and that American leadership, support for American defense, and support for free societies around the world is a core part and makes us safer, freer, and more prosperous as those well around us. We have over 80 chapters on college campuses where we do most of our work, where we send out scholars, thinkers, practitioners to actually debate college professors on issues of foreign policy and national security. And that chapter forms the basis of a really wonderful talent work. Many of you who are here tonight were part of that, that comes into Washington. And so we have 1,900 alumni and 700 of whom work in Washington, D.C., across the U.S. government a whole lot of different ways on both foreign policy and domestic policy. If you're interested in learning more about our work, you can go to www.alexanderhamiltonsociety.org. Tonight, our discussion really centers on an issue that is critical to actually our own mission, not just any old foreign policy issue, which is to the quality of education our students are receiving at their universities. And in addition to the, I hate to say it, but many self-inflicted damages that a lot of universities do to the type of education that they are providing their students, our universities have also become battlegrounds in the competition with our adversaries. This is not a new phenomenon. We saw it during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and frankly, we saw it quite a lot during the War on Terror era. But I think we are now only beginning to fully recognize it in relation to the Chinese Communist Party. From research partnerships with military applications, to university investments in Chinese companies tied to the Uyghur genocide, to instances of censorship and self-censorship, and even the presence of overseas Chinese policing efforts to monitor Chinese and Chinese American students, our universities are grappling with significant challenges. On a personal notice, I can't tell you in my 8.5 years leading this institution how many times our own students have told us something that they just feel is a little funny. Students who are participating in ROTC who feel like they're being watched. Students who are trying to advocate for freedom of expression and freedom of democracy in Taiwan and parts of China that get censored by the university. Chinese students, who are here overseas, who have to tell their professors privately that when class goes on Zoom, they need to give them a number instead of their name. They know who that is and go off screen so that that stuff doesn't get reported back home. A lot of this stuff is in our universities, some of it wittingly, a lot of it unwittingly. And if we are to prevail in this new Cold War that the PRC has initiated, we must ensure that our intellectual institutions, our cathedrals, our armories, are aligned with our national interests. And over the past year, I really can think of no two committees led by these two exceptional guests, the exceptional leaders that we have here tonight, that have done more critical work exposing how our adversaries have exploited our higher education system. And so it's a pleasure to introduce our guests tonight. First, Congresswoman Virginia Foxx, representing North Carolina's 5th District, and she serves as the chairwoman of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. She has been at the forefront of efforts to hold university leaders accountable for the troubling rise of anti-Semitism on so many campuses. And under her leadership, the committee has summoned numerous university presidents to testify before Congress. And let's just say that despite the fact that her committee also deals with workforce issues, she has inadvertently put a number of university people out of work as a consequence of their efforts. And next, we also are really excited to have Congressman John Moolenaar, who represents Michigan's 2nd Congressional District and serves as the chairman of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. Since its inception in this Congress, and I hope its continuation in the next one, the committee has been doing invaluable work shedding light on the comprehensive nature of the competition the CCP is waging against the United States. If you have been living under a rock over the last year, I don't know what to do because these two committees are the ones that are doing some of the most important work in Congress and actually getting results. And so we thank you for that work as well. And we're excited to have our conversation moderated tonight by our partner, the Washington Times, here tonight by Guy Taylor, National Security Editor and host of Threat Status at the Washington Times. After Guy leads our guests in conversations for a bit, we'll open the floor to questions and hope you come back to AHS at a future event. Thank you very much.
Well, they say when you're working with chair members of big committees, you work on their time, not your time. So thank you both for being here. It's an incredible honor. Thank you, Gabe Scheinman and AHS, an amazing organization. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at the Washington Times. Let's jump right into this. I've been reporting on the question of malign foreign influence in U.S. higher education for a while, and I can tell you that we really are, I think, at an inflection point in the debate over what the U.S. government should or shouldn't be doing to address the issue. It's a moment where there's kind of an organic upswell of legislation, investigative reports, attempts that are driven by constituents and courageous lawmakers to draw attention to the situation. And I think what's most special right now, just to reiterate what Gabe was saying, is that these two lawmakers are actually really right in the center of that, especially with the release of their joint committee report today on research security and China. We're going to dig into that in a minute, but I really want to start, I think more broadly with you, Chairwoman Foxx. Your committee really has been at the forefront of university accountability, especially since October 7 of last year, with everything from addressing anti-Semitism on campuses, the campus protests, the response by university administrations, but also big issues like Chinese influence and questionable partnerships. Can you start us off with some opening thoughts or framing remarks just on the question of how serious the current threat of malign foreign influence in American higher education is, and what's actually at stake here? Why is this such an important issue? And also, how has the landscape changed in the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, first, I want to thank you and the Alexander Hamilton Society, the Washington Times, for holding this event tonight. I do think it's very important that we keep a focus on what is happening in the university systems and across universities in the country. You know, I've said for a long, long time that this should be the most exciting time to be involved in education in the world because the opportunities out there for education are so great. We have online education. We have every form of education that you can imagine. And the American university system has always been seen as the crown jewel of university systems. The universities here are the places that everybody has wanted to come to from all over the world. But I fear greatly right now that our university systems, in terms of the malign powers that you mentioned, have become perhaps a liability because they've been infiltrated so much by people who are teaching things that are antithetical to what the Hamilton Society believes in, certainly, that we are an exceptional country, that we are an exceptional people, that we are a shining light on the hill. And so I worry about the fact that the universities have allowed themselves to be taken over. They've almost become daycare centers for whiny liberals. And when you look at it, I was reading an article, it's a couple of weeks old, about grades, for example, and how now the average grade at the most elite institutions is an A. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I think our universities are failing us in many, many ways. They are not teaching students critical thinking. They are not preparing students to go out from the universities to work and contribute to our society as they were formed to do. It's all become indoctrination and not critical thinking, not, again, preparation for the world of work, for making our society better. We live in the greatest country in the world. I make absolutely no apologies for that. We're still the freest country in the world, but the only way that we are going to be able to maintain our status in the world as the greatest country in the world is for us to do something about the things that are happening on our university campuses, to a certain extent in our K through 12 education also, and we've looked at that on the committee. So we have some real challenges ahead of us if we're going to maintain what has been the best education system in the world and continue to be the leaders in education.
I want to dive in a few minutes to what you said about universities becoming a liability, the infiltration possibly of malign actors. I also want to make a note to our audience here that we only have Chairwoman Fox for about 25 minutes. So we're going to go, well, I have both of you to talk about the joint report today, and then we're going to come back to that. Chairman Molinar, first of all, do you agree with Chairwoman Fox's characterizations, and do you have anything to add to it? And then I want to just jump right into the joint committee report released today. The summary was leaked early in the day. I wrote about it at the Washington Times. I know the New York Times covered it. It got quite a splash. The report eye-openingly uncovers how hundreds of U.S. universities are working with blacklisted Chinese institutions that are blacklisted by the Commerce Department. It found hundreds of millions of dollars flowing from U.S. taxpayers, research into China on really sensitive military technical research, like hypersonics, nuclear weapons tech. This is the first time that either of you will have spoken about it publicly. This is a pretty big report. Tell us about it and maybe what the impetus for this report was.
Sure. Well, first of all, Virginia Fox has done a wonderful job really looking at our higher education system and looking at the benefits of what we offer as a country and why we've been a leader in education, but also some of the areas that are creating challenges, and I appreciate her leadership on that. We've collaborated together on this report, which really looks at especially the STEM fields, and when it comes to high-tech research investments, and specifically research that was funded by the Department of Defense. And what we found is that there were close to 9,000 joint technical papers presented with collaboration between Chinese and American university professors. And so when you think that this research was being done with American taxpayer dollars funding defense, and then when you have to step back and say, okay, how is that used? Well, we know the People's Liberation Army in China often benefits from dual-use technologies, where something that maybe was invented for commercial purposes or for benefiting society suddenly is used in military purposes. And so what we found is that a lot of the research that is being done under this joint venture, if you will, is benefiting the military. And of course, we know that the Chinese Communist Party is becoming more aggressive at home and around the world, and is using every means to infiltrate our institutions and really disrupt our way of life. So that was the impetus. We looked at a number of different universities. In one case, Georgia Tech had partnered for 10 years in a joint educational venture with a university that was actually blacklisted. And what we found is there was research going on, you know, in sophisticated technology areas. You know, you can think of AI, advanced physics, all these applications that can be used for military purposes that could actually be used against American servicemen and women. Not only Georgia Tech, Berkeley was listed as one of the entities. Now, I want to point out that both of those institutions, since this report came to light and since they worked with our committee on these findings, they recognized the problem associated with these affiliations and have broken off those affiliations. But there's still, as you pointed out, close to 24 more joint educational ventures that directly benefit the military of the Chinese Communist Party.
The report definitely digs into specifically these joint institutes that have universities in China that are getting access to U.S. research and money. I want to try to understand that the report does not explicitly say that any laws were broken, right? So what is being done to stop this, and how is it that there aren't any laws on the books to try and address this?
Well, that is a huge concern, because you're right. It is not illegal for a professor at a university to collaborate with the People's Liberation Army, which is shocking when you think of that. So what we are advocating is really tightening the guardrails in terms of what is legal, what is not, what taxpayer dollars, especially defense dollars, can be used for in terms of the types of partnerships and educational arrangements. But, it's something where the universities have a mindset that this is contributing to the knowledge base of humanity, but they don't realize that because of the dual-use technologies and the adverse effects that can happen from this, that they're actually helping to support our military inferiority.
So there actually are several pieces of legislation that are moving, that have passed in the House. Chairwoman Fox, you've been a major proponent of the Deterrent Act, which actually passed the House last year, and it's sitting in the Senate now awaiting action. What would the Deterrent Act do if it's made into law? And is there anything you can tell us about the status on the Senate side?
Sure. Well, first let me say that it's really been great to work with John on this report. And I think many people who will read the report will have the same reaction that I've had. It is no surprise that China is doing everything that it can to become the #1 power in the world. And that it will use any means possible to do that. And so if it has an opportunity to take advantage of U.S. taxpayer dollars, it's certainly going to do that. And as Congressman Molnar said, our taxpayer dollars should be being used in our country to advance our systems and not to help the Communist Chinese advance their system. But let me talk a little bit about the Deterrent Act. I cannot remember what Deterrent Act stands for, so I had to write it down. I can remember sometimes an anagram of 4 letters, but that many is a lot. So the Deterrent Act stands for Defending Education Transparency and Ending Rogue Regimes Engaging in Nefarious Transactions. The staff that came up with the title and the anagram really deserve prizes. What the Deterrent Act does is strengthen Section 117 of the Foreign Gift Reporting Requirements in the Higher Education Act. It's not very strong now, but the Deterrent Act would make it much stronger. And yes, the bill passed last December. My recollection is that there are 31 Democrats and all Republicans who voted for it. What we found out, we actually, the law, the Section 1, what is now Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, was first passed in 1986. So we have been concerned about malign actors putting money into colleges and universities in this country for a long time. Unfortunately, there's been a lack of enforcement of that Section 117. And under the Trump administration and under Secretary DeVos, she began to realize that it was not being adhered to by the colleges and universities. And I can tell you a little bit more about what it does. The number one thing, and I want to make sure I don't forget any aspect of it, so I brought my notes with me. And we also know, to summarize something John said, is the Chinese exploit collaborations. They will exploit those collaborations at every point. We know that in 2019, the Senate issued a report that 70% of universities were failing to report their foreign gifts.
70%.
70% were not reporting their foreign gifts.
What is the culture at the administration's leading universities to allow that to happen? Is that just because of the laws just not being enforced?
Well, some would say they weren't aware of the law, but I think it's basically arrogance on the part of the universities. I think there's a lot of things that they do that shows their arrogance, and I think this is one of them. I think they're more than willing to flaunt the laws of the country. But let me tell you a little bit more about what the Deterrent Act does. Right now, under Section 117, universities have to report a gift of $250,000 or more, which is, a good bit of money, and only coming to the universities. So what we've done with the Deterrent Act is we have tightened it up considerably. So first, it lowers the minimum foreign gift reporting threshold from $250,000 to $50,000. But for countries of concern, that's North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia, any amount that is given is supposed to be reported. We closed the loopholes that allowed the foreign entities to donate money to hide, number one, the origin or purpose of their gifts. So every disclosure must include the intended purpose, the dates, and person at the institution responsible for accepting the gift.
So this sounds like common sense legislation that would easily pass. And I want to ask you why, first of all, how important is bipartisanship here? And is there bipartisanship on the Deterrent Act?
Yes, it was very strong bipartisanship. It passed actually, I think, the 6th of December, which was the day after our big hearing with University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and MIT. 31 Democrats and all Republicans voted for the bill. That's a big bipartisan vote. It's been sitting in the Senate ever since then on Chuck Schumer's desk. Another part of the bill...
Why is that? I mean, is there lobbying going on by universities to stop it, or is it partisanship?
I am sure there is lobbying going on by the universities. I cannot tell you. I've not spoken directly to Senator Schumer about the bill, so I can't tell you exactly why. but I think we've passed somewhere close to 700 bills that have gone to the Senate, and I believe this year 70 bills have been signed into law. So a lot of bills are sitting.
And more controversial ones with regard to foreign influence. We had Raja Krishnamurthy's TikTok legislation, which would ban a very popular, controversial social media, make it through and get signed by the president. So it's curious that deterrent is not getting there, because we only have you for a little while longer.
That's all right.
I want to try to. I want to stay with Chairwoman Fox, and then we'll go back to the report. Because the committee has been, as you mentioned, with these very contentious hearings that were incredibly impactful. It's really been at the center of the issue of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic propaganda. You've got a couple of investigations going on. One of the more interesting ones that we've covered at the Washington Times, it got some traction, is this question that your committee is asking about whether or not there's any foreign involvement in this chaos that went on a lot of college campuses last year, with protests that in many ways were anti-Semitic. There's an intersection with ODNI, Office of Director of National Intelligence. Avril Haines had a statement in July that said U.S. intel has observed actors tied to Iran's government posing as activists online, seeking to encourage protests, even providing financial support to protesters. Has your committee investigation so far revealed any evidence or found any evidence of dark money from Iran? Possibly Qatar is another big gift giver to U.S. universities. What can you tell us about this?
Well, we're not ready to issue a report yet, Guy, and I'm not going to run away, so I'm going to stay around for a little bit longer. So if that helps you.
They're waving at me from off stage.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's all right. But we have not linked dark money yet to the demonstrations, but other organizations have looked at the amount of money coming in to the institutions from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other places. It seems extremely suspicious to me that on October 8th, the day after Hamas so viciously attacked Israel, that suddenly you had all these signs, tents, organized people out there on the campuses protesting, not Hamas, but protesting Israel. And so there are a lot of concerns about where the money is coming from on the campuses, and we have a lot to discover about that.
More broadly, following October 7, this issue really seemed to explode into the mainstream. I mean, your hearings were broadcast prime time during the day. Has that made a difference in sort of awakening Congress or shifting the momentum to address the wider issue of potentially malign and malign foreign influence in higher education?
It's not only, I think, awakened members of Congress, but I think it's awakened the American people to the malign activities that are going on. I think never before has post-secondary education been held in such low esteem in our country. And as a product of post-secondary education, and as someone who taught in post-secondary education and believes so much in the value of learning, particularly at higher levels, it just breaks my heart to see this happening. But right now, enrollments are down. They're not only down in what have previously been called elite institutions, but they're down in many, many baccalaureate institutions. They're actually up in community colleges, because people are seeing ways that they can gain the skills they need to fill the jobs that are out there. But the enrollments are down significantly in much of post-secondary education. And again, among those institutions that are called, previously called elite institutions.
What can Congress do to address issues if we're about to potentially see another wave of protests in the coming months? What role does the U.S. government have? At what point is there pushback that there's the U.S. government hand is getting involved in free education? What can Congress do to try to continue to bring attention to the issue?
Well, we have several pieces of legislation, but the key to all of this is transparency. That's what the Deterrent Act does. It requires the colleges and universities to report all the way down to the individual faculty member. What money is coming in, why is the money coming in, how is it being used? So transparency is a key. I have said since I've been chair of the committee that the two issues that are most important to education are transparency and accountability. So we have the College Cost Reduction Act, we have the Stronger Workforce for America Act. That's a workforce bill, but it's basically an education bill. And so we want transparency. We want the public to know what does it cost to go to the university, how long is it going to take, what are the chances of you getting a job with the degree. And we want the public, well, we want all the institutions to be held accountable for the billions of taxpayer dollars that are going into the universities. And we'd like to see them, along again with K-12, where we have found malign money going also, particularly from China. But we want, and from Qatar, we want to see there to be accountability. And we believe that when we expose what's happening, where the money's coming from, and then parents can see connections between the money and what's happening, then we think we will see a difference. For all of you who know anything about the Constitution, you will know that the word education is not in there as a prerogative of the federal government. It is not up to the federal government to be involved in education. So while I can't get the federal government out of education, my next best thing is to require transparency and accountability. And so that's been the hallmark of my work in the Congress when it comes to education.
Well, I've got both of you still up here because we're going to get to audience questions in a little bit, and that may be when a good time for you to go out. But I want to ask one more that I think people in the general public, and I know we have a very informed audience with Alexander Hamilton Society, but one of the issues that really brought back to the China influence here was the issue of Confucius Institutes. These are basically institutes on campuses in the United States that are funded by entities tied back to the Chinese Communist Party that the U.S. State Department has called out. Both of you have called out. Back in 2020, the State Department basically strongly urged universities to take a hard look at Confucius Institutes. These are institutes that were accused of spying on the Chinese diaspora, Chinese students with visas to study here, faculty. I want to try to just unpack that a little bit so that, because I know you both are on top of it, but sometimes I think people don't understand what was China actually doing with the Confucius Institutes.
Well, first thing I want to do is give a shout out to Joe Wilson from South Carolina. Joe, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, started highlighting the dangers of the Confucius Institute. I can't remember the exact year that he did it, but Joe said the Confucius Institutes are malign institutes, and something needs to be done about them. He had a hard time getting people to pay attention. But what they've tried to do is subtly and not so subtly change the way people think about China and have people think about China in positive ways. And I think they have done a lot to infiltrate the campuses. But I think one of the basic things they've done is to try to get people to believe China's really not a bad culture, and that it's okay to like China and to feel okay with China.
Or the Chinese Communist Party?
The Chinese Communist Party. Not the Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist Party. But to say that it's really not as bad as maybe some in America have portrayed it to be.
Has the issue been resolved?
No.
That's what I mean.
Many
A
of
lot
them,
these
they've
places,
quit calling themselves Confucius Institutes in most places. They now call themselves cultural centers and other kinds of things. So no, it hasn't exactly been resolved because it's sort of a trite expression perhaps, but they've sort of gone underground. They're not as conspicuous as they were before. And the report, again, will say a lot more about that.
And I think it's important to note that what the CCP does, whether it's at home or abroad, is uses leverage. And they will leverage people in this country. If they're Chinese, they will leverage them and they will try and get them to get information. And the reason people are vulnerable is that the Chinese national security laws require anyone to collaborate with the CCP. And if they don't, they are in violation of the national security law, no matter what soil they're on. So we have heard as a committee stories of students who were from Hong Kong and were being, transnational repression, being bullied, being intimidated. We've heard about the police stations in New York and other locations being used to intimidate the Chinese diaspora. So, we love the Chinese people. It's the Chinese Communist Party that is the malign influence, and that is where the problem is.
Again here, we're going to lose Chairwoman Fox. Thank you so much for being with us. We're going to reconnoiter, and we'll finish up on Confucius Institutes, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. So we've got a new bill that passed in the House, the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese Entities Concerned Act. I believe that's August Pfluger's bill. That would push to put more teeth into attempts to try and get universities to address the issue. Not the Deterrent Act could, but I guess my question for you is, do we need legislation that actually has more teeth, or is the relationship between the government and big state universities and private universities such that that conversation just is difficult? It's not happening and it's difficult.
Well, it's a difficult conversation, but it needs to happen, and that's why we had it with Georgia Tech, why we had it with Berkeley, and they have actually reversed course. The other institutes, the universities that are partner with Chinese entities, I think now with the release of this report, I think there's going to be greater accountability. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet is that some states, like my home state of Michigan, have a university autonomy built right into the Constitution of the state. And that basically says the state government can't really tell the university what to do. They can fund the university, but in terms of there's this really high threshold of what the government can tell the university. I think we need to get to the right balance that says we want to have academic freedom. We want to encourage scholarship. We don't want people to have consequences for, innovative research. But we have to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party will use our freedoms against us. And we see that time and time again. It's a very different China than we had hoped for. Maybe 30 years ago, when people thought that China would become more democratic, more freedom-loving, more part of the international rules-based order. And instead, what we've seen is a bully throughout Asia, threatening other nations, and even on our soil, when you have a spy balloon flying overhead, when you have the Chinese police stations, when you have the fentanyl, and that's something I'd like to talk with your audience about. Our committee did a report. We know about the fentanyl coming across our southern border. The investigation we did actually showed that the Chinese Communist Party is subsidizing it through tax rebates to encourage Chinese chemical companies to manufacture the precursors to fentanyl and then partner with the Mexican drug cartels to get it across our southern border. When you realize this is happening at the same time when Xi Jinping is meeting with President Biden and pledging cooperation to help the U.S. with its fentanyl problem. So we're dealing with a very different entity than we had hoped for, and we need to be clear-eyed about that.
I'll ask one more, and
Sure.
then are we almost ready here to start to go to the audience? Do you anticipate, one of the things in the report today that jumped out at me was some careful language that was very honest, but it was also critical of the Biden-Harris administration for not enforcing the Higher Education Act guardrails that are in place on universities that don't report gifts regularly on time above a certain threshold. So my question is how important politics are to this? Do you anticipate that if there is a Trump administration, that President Trump comes in and begins demanding, in fact, far stronger legislation, is putting pressure, if the Democrats are holding the Senate, is putting pressure? Or do you think that that President Trump will go along with this sort of lack of enforcement if there's a President Trump? And then also, how might a Harris administration handle it?
My sense is that the Trump administration will be much stronger on this. Yeah. And, it is surprising that there have been no enforcement actions.
Yeah.
And disappointing, because clearly this is a huge problem. Now, there's a lot of money at stake at universities. There are a lot of partnerships that are challenging to unwind. But, and you could say that there is some type of, maybe there isn't an awareness of the problem. And that's all understandable. But when you're aware of the problem, there needs to be swift action. And I believe now that this report has come out, I think these kinds of questions will be asked and there should be enforcement actions.
Are we ready for audience questions? I'm going to ask that we have about 15, 20 minutes for this, and I'm going to ask that you announce yourself, if you will, your name, organization you're representing, and let's try to keep it to one question and not long comments, please. You have the microphone here. I think there's one here and then one here.
Hi there, I'm with Georgetown, and I'm interested in knowing how you think that the dual-use research of concern policy plays into the CCP's influence in universities.
China has made it a goal to be a technology leader. And a lot of the way they've done that is stealing intellectual property, partnering with entities in the private sector at universities, extracting the information, and then sort of booting the partner out of the equation. So we've seen that in the private sector where they'll have a joint venture, get the technology, get the product developed, and then the partner's no longer welcome. We've seen that over and over again. They are doing research in areas, quantum mechanics, different quantum computing, the AI, even, when you think of hypersonic missiles, you think of this advanced physics. When they partner with U.S. universities who are leading in this area, extract that information and then use it for military purposes. So, they are developing a huge military arsenal. They're threatening their neighbors in South China Sea. We've seen that over and over again. They're not respecting international boundaries, and they're using their military as an intimidating force. They're working on that in space. So, the question is really, to what extent should our universities, our taxpayer dollars, be funding an adversary that will use that against us? And that's the difference between, a country where we're partnering on research for mutually beneficial products that'll improve people's lives.
I want to add a quick question on top of this, because this brings up another thing in today's report, which is the focus on research that was funded by DoD or intelligence community funding or grants. There's kind of an elephant in the room with that, which is we've been talking about awareness at universities and in university administrations, but what about within the U.S. defense community and at the Pentagon? And what can you tell us about the thinking there?
I think this needs to be a huge wake-up call. When you look at the funding that we do, whether it's defense dollars or even energy grants and research, and we've, in the appropriations process, have really tried to restrict our dollars from going to entities of concern, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. And it's shocking when you see these grants, whether it's energy, defense, others, National Science Foundation, that are partnering with entities of concern. Right. And so I do think it's a wake-up call for and I think our defense and our intelligence community has a growing awareness and concern about this, and recognize that it's our men and women on the front lines in our military who will be directly affected by this if we get this wrong.
Do we have another one? So we have right in the front row here, and then we're going to go to the back, and then we'll come back up to the front.
Thank you. My question is about the transnational repression. Just now you mentioned about that. But my question is, because in the last few months, I tried to get some interviews with Chinese students here to talk about their experience, how their family, like in China, were harassed or threatened by the Chinese Communist Party. But none of them dared to talk with me directly. So I'm wondering, do you have any conversation with universities about how to protect those Chinese students and academia freedom here? Thank you.
Well, that is a great point, because you're right. There needs to be that sense of where students feel protected and they can go to their institution and communicate. It's a lot like, I was a school administrator, and when you have a child that's being bullied, right? And the child's trying to figure out how to handle it on its own, doesn't want to talk to their parents about it, doesn't want to talk to the administrators about it, and it continues to get worse. In this case, you have students who, if they speak out, they will be intimidated by other students on campus, or even through these police stations we saw in New York City, where they had lists of people, the Chinese diaspora, and it was under the guise of being sort of a social service agency trying to help Chinese people with driver's licenses or whatever needs they had. And that was the database they were using to then monitor, social networks and different things to use to intimidate. And at the same time, then their family at home is at risk because they're living in China, and if they speak out, then they can be threatened and in some cases can disappear. And, so I think universities need a better understanding of how this is affecting students on campus. And you're right, we need to do a better job of informing. And then I would say universities need to do more in the area of training. I mean, so every student should feel safe on campus, and it shouldn't be safe from academic rigorous debate, but it should be safe from threats, from harm, and that kind of intimidation.
We had one in the middle here. Yep, right. In one. Raise your hand high. There you go. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Tal. I'm working in the Senate. So my question is, there was a lot of discussion of transparency tonight. Is the hope that universities like Georgia Tech did and Berkeley did will just see the light and course correct by being required to be transparent? Or will there eventually be legislation making it actually illegal to collaborate with blacklisted or entities of concern?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you heard tonight from Virginia Fox is, that legislation would create a threshold of 0 so that they would be required to report. And then if people were in violation of that, like many institutions are in violation of these kind of reporting requirements that already exist, there should be enforcement action. But I do think there is a need for greater awareness. I think there's a mindset in our universities and in some degrees just people in general in our country that view the Chinese Communist Party as just sort of a benign thing, because they talked about, communism with Chinese characteristics, sort of a more mellow version. What we've seen under Xi Jinping is exactly the opposite of that. And he's purged the opposition. We've seen a commitment to a Hong Kong that is based on, two systems, one country, that has completely been abandoned. And now you have any opposition speaking out is in prison. So the reality is very different than maybe what we'd hoped for, or even what people have in their own mindset about what China's Communist Party is all about. The other thing is, in the private sector, most in the private sector probably don't realize that when they collaborate with a business in China, if at any point the government says they want information from that business in China, they are required under their national security law to turn that over. And that's why, it was, to me, shocking when the CEO of TikTok was saying, well, they would never give information of their customers to the Chinese Communist Party or they would be going to prison. They would be in violation of the national security laws if that was required. So it's just a very different system than most people realize. And so I think that's why the transparency and the enforcement becomes so important.
We had another one here, and then we're going to do a couple of more. There's one here, one way in the back, and then the last one will be up here.
Sir, thank you for joining us tonight.
Sure.
My name is Wendell Bryant. I'm from the Institute of World Politics. The United States has been leading the world as the apex nation for some 35 years. At the top, I believe the American body politic has grown apathetic and stagnant. to external threats. How do we invigorate the American people to confront this growing concern before it becomes something more than a conversation?
It's a great question. I think, in my view, when it comes to specifically with respect to China, we need to work with our allies and build closer relationships. You know, I just finished a book on Ronald Reagan by actually one of your board members, William Imboden.
Oh, okay.
And he talked about how President Reagan was very committed to the Allies and working with the Allies. You know, Japan at that time, West Germany. He had his sort of group, Margaret Thatcher, working together, Brian Mulroney from Canada. And so at the same time, he was really leading when it came to competing with the Soviet Union economically, militarily. He was also building these friendships, these alliances, these partnerships. I don't think we've ever had a time where our relationship with Japan is closer and needs to be closer. And South Korea, and you look at the Philippines, we're building relationships there. I think we need to keep growing that, because I think what the American people are weary of is they feel like America's going alone in this, and all these dollars are being spent, and they don't see the sort of this allied effort. And so I think that's a big part of it. And we need to be clear about what our objectives are, and that's the other key thing. And so our select committee talks about winning this strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party, and it truly is a competition. And basically the international rules-based order that we've all benefited from is at stake with this, because they have a very different idea of what the future looks like. And you can see it through their creating indebtedness around the world, and through their Belt and Road initiatives. They're becoming more aggressive militarily, ignoring boundaries and threatening their neighbors. So I think you're right, we need to keep making people aware of the situation we have, but I think we have to give them the confidence that this is not a solo effort on our part. This is people who are like-minded countries working together because we want to protect what we've all benefited from.
All right, I'm being told that we're running out of time, and there were two more, so if we very quickly ask one and then the other, perhaps we have the chairman to take who was it?
There's one in back.
There was
two
one,
in back. There's one right there.
There's one in the back, and there's one in the back, and then the last one right here on the row. Raise your hand high. So we'll hear the question, then we'll hear the second question right after, and then we're going to end this part of it.
Hi, my name is Catherine Clark. I'm a contractor for USAID. I'm curious, are there lessons from history you can learn of the United States Cold War with Russia? Were there comparable influence efforts by the Russian state to influence American higher education at that time? And if so, are there lessons learned we have from that time period that we can learn from in the present?
It's a great question.
Let's take the other question at the same time.
Thank you for being here. My name is Cynthia Sun. I'm with the Falun Dafa Information Center. I've done research on Confucius Institute's transnational repression, and in my research I found a very problematic Chinese language textbook that's been being taught at top U.S. universities for over 20 years now. In the Deterrent Act, would it be possible to address curriculum like this separate of Confucius Institutes? Thank you.
Well, two great questions. Maybe I'll start with the lessons from history. And, you know, President Reagan, when he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, experienced dealing with communism and Hollywood. And that created an awareness on his part of sort of the dangers of that. And so I think throughout his life, he was very much an advocate for our way of life, the freedoms that we enjoy, limited government, actually the things that you all stand for at the Alexander Hamilton Society. And that was very much ingrained. And I think, you know, universities at that time, I think he was aware of influences there. But, you know, I think this could be an overstatement, but it seems like Russia's influence operation was more covert, and it was sort of in centers like Washington, D.C., New York, maybe at key places. What China's doing is really trying to infiltrate every aspect of the private sector, every kind of across the board, universities, and then the cultural, and they're being very deceptive about it, but the influence is much, and the dependency that we have economically on them, and the dependency that other nations have on them makes it much more complicated, I believe, than we had with Russia. So I think that requires kind of an all hands on deck to really focus on what has made America unique, what have we benefited from in the free world, how can we align with countries around the world that really want to pursue that, and then build from there, because, you know, China has so much influence economically, now militarily, that we need to win the argument, but we also need to win economically and militarily when it comes to this competition. So that's I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned. I would say his relentless focus on calling out the Soviet Union for what it was. I mean, you know, the State Department was really trying to get him not to say, tear down this wall. He did. And, you know, so there's always going to be that tension. You don't want to be provocative, but at the same time, you want to speak truthfully and really get the issues out there. And I think he did a great job with that. So in terms of the books, I don't know that you'd have a federal government initiative like that, but I do think this idea of transparency and accountability, I think the more transparent things are, then the more accountability there is. And I think those were the two messages I heard from her today. Some of that could be legislative, but a lot of it on the federal level is probably going to be hearings, highlighting the issue, and making sure people are aware that something is very deceptive, and that shouldn't be part of the program.
Chairman John Molinar,
thank you very much.
So much. Thank you to Alexander
Thanks so
Hamilton
much.
Society, Threat Status at the Washington Times. Thank you to C-SPAN as well. That brings us to the end of this part of our program.
All right. Thank you very much.
Just to let you know, the bar's still